Okay, so when you think about church leadership, what comes to mind? Probably a really clear hierarchy, right? A pyramid structure? Well, what if I told you that for the first century of its existence, the Christian movement was, well, kind of chaotic, super experimental, and wildly decentralized? Today, we're going to dive into that surprising journey from the charismatic apostle to the organized bishop.
But before we even get into the who's who and the different roles, we've got to get the mindset right. See, today, we often think of leadership as a career path, something you climb. In the early church, though, it was the exact opposite. It was seen as a dono, a gift, and a kiamata, a calling. You didn't climb a ladder, you answered a call. And trust me, that one idea, it changes everything.
All right, let's fire up the time machine. Picture it. The year is 50 AD. You walk into a Christian community. So, who's in charge? If you're picturing a bishop in a big pointy hat, well, you're in the wrong century by a long shot. The reality was way more fluid and, honestly, a lot messier. So how do we piece this puzzle together? Well, we can't start with job titles. That's not going to work. We have to start with the one fundamental belief that drove absolutely everything, this idea of a divine call. And this whole concept of dono and chiamata, the gift and the call, it wasn't just some abstract theology, It had serious real-world consequences. It meant that authority didn't come from your personal ambition or even how much of an expert you are. Nope. It was a responsibility given by God for the community. That was the absolute bedrock of their entire leadership model. And where did this all start? Well, with the originators, of course, the apostles. And we need to be crystal clear about this. These guys weren't middle managers, not even close. They were the trailblazing, visionary founders of a whole new global movement. The role of an apostle was, and this is key, absolutely unique and unrepeatable. So what set them apart? Simple. They were direct, personal witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. Their authority didn't come from some committee or an election. It came from being personally sent on a mission by him. That direct commission, that was everything. So, what did being sent actually mean in practice? Well, it meant they were basically everything all at once. They were the lead evangelist, the startup founder, the community governor, and the head of rituals. These four core functions, announcing the gospel, founding churches, governing them, and presiding over rites, that became the essential DNA for all church leadership that would follow. Okay, now this is where things get really fascinating. Once an apostle planted a church and then moved on to the next town, they didn't just leave behind some corporate franchise manual, Here's how to build your church, page by page. It was much more like a startup incubator, with each local community having to experiment and figure out its own model for governance. And look, this wasn't just a brief period of confusion. We're talking about an experimental phase that lasted for about 80 years. 80! Just think about that for a second. That is an entire human lifetime of different communities trying different things with diverse, evolving, and sometimes even competing models of leadership, all before any single pattern even began to emerge as the standard. And you can see two of these early startup models right away, and they're pretty different. On one hand, you've got the churches Paul founded out in the Greek territories. They were super dynamic, decentralized, and led by these itinerant, charismatic figures, apostles, prophets, teachers on the move. But then, on the other hand, you had the head office, so to speak, back in Jerusalem. That was way more traditional and stable. It was structured a lot like the Jewish Sanhedrin, with these pillars like James, Peter, and John, and a formal college of presbyters. Now, all this diversity in models, it created a real linguistic headache. Seriously, the job titles that we just take for granted today, bishop, priest, they didn't really exist as we know them. The exact same Greek word could mean one thing in a church in Corinth and something totally different in Antioch. So let's look at the first key term, episkopos. In Greek, this word just means overseer or guardian. It wasn't a formal title for an office. It was a functional description of a job someone was doing, basically supervising the community's affairs. Then you have the second term, presbyteros. This is Greek for elder. Now, this title was borrowed straight from Jewish tradition, and it was all about showing respect for a community leader, someone known for their age and their wisdom. It was really a title of honor, not necessarily a specific job description. Okay, so here is the single most crucial point to get about this period. For decades, these two titles, episkopos and presbyteros, were not distinct ranks. They were often used completely interchangeably to talk about the very same group of people, a collective council of overseer elders who were running the local community together. But, things change. As the church got bigger and started facing new challenges like heresy and persecution, this fluid, council-based system started to solidify. It began to take on a much more defined pattern. And luckily for us, one historical figure gives us the first crystal-clear snapshot of this massive shift. You can really see this evolution happening in three distinct phases. First, you've got the apostolic age, when the original founders were still around. Then, after they're gone, you get this post-apostolic transitional period where these local councils of presbytero episcopoe, those overseer elders, are in charge. And then finally, right around the year 110, something totally new and much more structured starts to pop up, what we call the Ignatian model. And that model gets its name from this guy, Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch. In a series of letters he wrote, get this, while he was on his way to be martyred in Rome, he gives us the very first completely unambiguous, detailed description of a three-tiered church hierarchy. And in Ignatius's model, the structure suddenly snaps into focus. It's crystal clear. At the very top, you have one single bishop. He's the principle of unity, representing God the Father. He's supported by his council of presbyters, who are meant to represent the college of apostles gathered around him. And then, serving them all, you have the deacons, who represent Christ the servant. All of a sudden, that fluid, experimental system crystallizes into a defined theological hierarchy. So let's zoom out. What's the major takeaway from this whole 80-year transformation? What does this journey, from a loose collection of startups to a more structured organization, really tell us? Well, the core story here is one of evolution. The church started out as this dynamic, fast-moving mission led by its charismatic founders, the apostles. But over time, in order to survive and to maintain doctrinal consistency, it had to mature. It became a stable, local institution led by successors, the bishops, who were grounded in specific communities. And this leaves us with a huge question, one that pretty much every successful movement or company or even nation eventually has to face. How do you keep the original fire of the founding mission alive without getting choked out by the very structures you build to protect that fire? That's the timeless tension, right there, between the spirit of the apostle and the structure of the bishop. And that's a challenge that, frankly, never gets old.